Hello, everyone. My name is Geoffrey Clark. This is the Naval Power Index, United States versus three competitors. It'll take the form of some PowerPoint slides. After that, I'll transition to a brief demonstration of some analytics that I've been preparing for this. So, without further ado, let's begin. Who is Geoffrey Clark? Well, my interest in military and aviation affairs comes from my father, who was a titanium metallurgist with Boeing, as well as a U.S. Air Force civilian engineer. He worked on Saturn V rocket, supersonic transport. Last project was F-22. So at a young age, I began reading old copies of Aviation Week and Space Technology. He also was very interested in data, although his definition of data and our current definition of data may be somewhat different. He was always about getting the data. So I had been doing lots of blogging for Mystics and Statistics for several years. There was a pause in that, but I hope to continue to blog working with Chris. I've been a resident of Japan since 2018. I've been working in the field of business intelligence and most recently artificial intelligence. I've been working with IT since about 2000. 2001. So, naval vessels. I saw this photograph in the South China Morning Post back in September 2023, and I thought to myself, wow, the Cold War is alive and well, because that aircraft carrier in the distance is, it's actually the Shandong, the Chinese rebuilt Kuznetsov carrier, but the original, the Varyag, has a long history. Maybe many of you know it. In fact, it's classified as a heavy aircraft carrying cruiser because of the Montreux Convention. So that's Soviet equipment, long legacy of Soviet equipment. And the ship in the foreground is a Kidd-class destroyer. So that is American built, of one of four ships actually built under contract to be sold to Iran before the Iranian Revolution, and then repurposed and sold to Taiwan. And so here we have, the American and Soviet naval competition reborn and at sea today. So very interesting legacy here. And largely this is because naval assets have such a long lead time and long service life that it's multi-decade, and sometimes more than 50 years. So I like this quote from Admiral Hyman Rickover: "A page of history is worth a book of logic," and that's why I'm here presenting the historical analysis annual conference. Because I live in Japan, I'm looking at the Chinese military, and specifically the Chinese naval buildup that's been happening over a long period of time now. And there's many questions about what is the intent there. That there's clearly a stated intent to challenge the U.S. Navy and be able to achieve their objectives relative to Taiwan. But just as we might look at Russian activity in Europe and wonder what comes next, you might also look at Chinese activity as a Japanese and say, what happens after Taiwan? Or are there further ambitions? There's a long history since this time of putting this presentation together. I've been studying the history of the Sino-Japanese War, 1894. Prior to this time, the Chinese, this is the last time the Chinese had a significant navy. After that war, and their navy was sunk by the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Chinese really haven't had a navy to speak of until this last several decades. So very, very interesting. So I was asking myself, as I'm building up this database, which I'll talk about the sources of in a moment, I've been asking myself, what era of ship and what era of shipbuilding should I really be looking? And so the Pacific War became a pretty interesting topic. Many people would say, well, technology has changed. There's not much to be learned by looking at that history in detail, but I'm not sure that that is the case. I think that there are still lessons to be learned looking at those operations. So, where do I get my data? I really liked Tom Clancy's answer when he was speaking at the National Security Agency. He said, Jane's fighting ships and harpoon. That's where I get my data. So you'll see the legacy of that in what I'll present here in a moment. These are the sources of data for this database that I've been building up on naval shipbuilding. One of the other think tanks here, Center for Naval Analysis, they began to publish what they called the Integrated Ship Database, which was an integrated set of data on vessels in the U.S. Navy, as well as support vessels. But they stopped publishing that about circa 2013. That was great because it got me thinking about this and also highlighted what they considered to be the official sources. And so, in fact, the Naval Vessel Registry and the Dictionary of American Fighting Ships, as well as at the time, U.S. Navy Fact File, are very interesting sources of data. There was another guy, a hobbyist, Tim Colton. He passed away in 2016, but his site is still up, called Shipbuilding History, which is fantastic because it goes all the way back to prior to World War I, and many of the ships that were impressed into the U.S. Navy during World War I. So I've been using that as a source as well. And then, of course, what is now called Admiralty Trilogy, Larry Bond and Chris Carlson, they do fantastic work, publishing most recently Harpoon 5. I like these graphics of different ships. This is one for the U.S. Navy that was published back in 2015. Here's another one, ships of the U.S. Navy's Military SEAL Command. Looking at this, there have been many people who are concerned about the status of American shipbuilding, and I think that they have a good point. U.S. Navy data is much easier to come by, I think, reflecting our open society, really. Data sources for China are somewhat different. There's no official naval vessel registry, at least not that is publicly available. So you have to get your data from other sources. So I started with Wikipedia, both English and Japanese versions, and mostly studying the Japanese version because there's a lot of Japanese hobbyists who are very keen on what's happening in China. And also, they're much more likely to report the correct Chinese characters that are used for the ship than the English version of Wikipedia. But nonetheless, I was very disappointed with the quality of the data that was on Wikipedia. There's many gaps. It's not really an official source. So I began using data from globalsecurity.org, as well as the Office of Naval Intelligence. An interesting note that Office of Naval Intelligence has been doing this for quite some time. In doing this research, I also came upon publications from them talking about the Imperial Japanese Navy, which were very interesting. So I can recommend those as a good source. And of course, the Admiralty Trilogy has great data on the Chinese Navy and various other sources, hobbyist websites and such. This is one example. This is coming from the Office of Naval Intelligence. You can see that especially with the other services. China has multiple maritime services, not just the People's Liberation Army Navy, but also the People's Maritime Police and the Chinese Coast Guard. They are almost continuously changing their pennant numbers on their ships. It's very reminiscent of the Soviet Navy in the Cold War, where you might even see paint peeling off and revealing the old number. Not quite that bad with the Chinese Navy, but it's very interesting. So there's a time difference that depending upon when this data is harvested. If you're lucky, you'll get a reference that says, "Oh, it used to be this pennant number, now it's this pennant number." But other than that, I think it's done intentionally to hide their numbers. And notice, at least on this chart, this is all surface vessels. There's no submarines at all on this chart. You have to go elsewhere for that detail. This book by Manfred Meyer, published by the Admiralty group, was a fantastic book. So I highly recommend this book. Also, a good reference from Dr. Andrew Erickson of the U.S. Naval War College. So, as I mentioned, this is about history. So it's not just the current Chinese Navy, but I also looked at the Cold War, USSR, and the data for that Navy, since the U.S. was involved in a naval buildup and challenge with the Soviets. So these are the sources that I mentioned. Subbrief is an excellent channel on YouTube. RussianShips.info is basically Russian hobbyists. And the great thing about that is they have the pennant numbers that I mentioned were unreliable, but they also have the construction number of the hull. So it's very good to be that construction number, very much like a serial number for a piece of equipment, doesn't change. Whereas the pennant number may change many times during the lifetime of that ship. So that I found that to be a fantastic site that they're published in. And during the most recent war, the site is not an official government site, so people from outside of Russia still have access to this site. Also, the Office of Naval Intelligence publishes an excellent recognition and identification guide for the Russian Navy that extends back to the Soviet time as well. Various other sources. So this is an example, submarines of the Russian Navy 2019. This is an example of some of the data that you can get from Harpoon 5. So on the left, you can see the entry for the Oscar II SSGN. So you can see in the remarks that there's a significant amount of history of what has happened with these hulls. In the middle, there's a good example. This is the Slava class cruiser in service since 1983, and famously one of three remaining ships was sunk by the Ukrainian Navy a while back. And then on the right, you can see an example of the kind of aircraft and the kind of detail that exists for, in this case, the backfire bomber. So I find this data to be very useful. And the only challenge with this is it arrives in PDF form. And so for a database analyst like me, this data needs to be transformed into a format that is useful in order to be combined and integrated and that sort of thing. So I'll show the end result after a lot of tedious work by yours truly to transform this data. Another source, another war game that is relatively popular is called Command Modern Operations. And if you purchase a license for this, this will come with a SQLite database. And that database, although it's a little bit difficult to query, I've spent some time to really understand what's going on here. So this is one subject area within that database that I've reverse engineered into a data model. This is the kind of stuff that I do on a professional basis with corporate data. So doing this for military data wasn't too much of a difficult leap for me. And so this, I believe, is published by a group of people at Matrix Games. I think that Paul Weber used to be part of the group that designed this. I think that he works in Portsmouth now. But he's had to depart this group because he went back to work for the U.S. Navy. But this is one excellent source. I found in some cases that it's incomplete, that there are some things that are missing. So it's great to have multiple sources to cross-reference and corroborate information. But still, getting this kind of data in a database format is much better than having to construct your own with PDF data. So that was welcome. So with that said, that talks about all my sources. I'm going to switch now to look at this is a tool from my former company. This is I used to work for MicroStrategy, whose headquarters are just across the street here in Tyson's Corner. This data that I've mentioned has now been imported into some in-memory cubes for people who are IT knowledgeable, and then we're visualizing it now on a dashboard. So starting here, we can see that that we've got time across the bottom ascending to the right, and then we have counts of vessels. Those are the bars, and so we can see that the blue is the U.S. and the orange is Japan. This goes up to 1940, so you can see here in the 1918, 1919, 1920, this is the U.S. buildup to and through World War I. We can also see 1905, 56 vessels built by the U.S. This is the Great White Fleet. So I thought that this was pretty good. You know, getting data all the way back to 1874. I think that I can shift it now. If we go look at, let's go to 1945. So now we can put that into perspective to understand how many ships the U.S. was building in, really starting in 43 and 44. We see an enormous shipbuilding program come to fruition. And you know, we can compare that with the Japanese, Imperial Japanese Navy, right? They like some people say, you know, the Battle of Midway, that spelled the end. Well, even if they had won the Battle of Midway, I think that they would have been shortly thereafter confronted with another naval battle and been outnumbered shortly. So it was really just a matter of time. Let's now accelerate this. Let's go up to, let's take this up to 1989. So we can now see most of the Cold War, and we can put that, you know, in perspective to World War II, right? So one was a hot war and one was a Cold War. One was a relatively compact duration, one was spread out over decades. So just to better understand what's going on here, let's just take this to 1946. So you can see the Soviet Union is in purple, the Chinese are in red, and the Americans remain in blue. So in the 50s, you can see that the Soviet Union really took off in terms of building ships. I think they had to because the Americans still had a sizable navy from World War II. But you also see, I think actually these 99 vessels by the Chinese, I think that is a little bit of a data quality issue. So you can imagine that the Chinese Navy buildup during this period of time is a bit more smooth through these years. But still, it's very interesting to see the Soviet Union under, I think, under the leadership of Gorshkov and the Gorshkov Doctrine about challenging the U.S. Navy at sea. There's some debate about this recently that Norman Volmar, a great naval historian, had challenged the idea that the Americans had that the Soviets were prepared in World War III to refight the Battle of the Atlantic. And some research into that indicated that that idea probably came from some advisors to the U.S. government who came from Germany and were interested in the concept of, well, now if we had the nuclear submarines, what would it be like if we refought the Battle of the Atlantic? I think that with the opening of the Soviet archives during that period, you can see that they really weren't interested in that. They felt like the Germans tried it. The Germans were not successful. The Americans and the British were ready for that, and that there was not a lot of strategic advantage to gain by refighting the Battle of the Atlantic. Their forces were much more defensively oriented in terms of their doctrine than the Americans had considered. The Americans had considered, you see these graphics from this period of time where there's this big red arrow coming out of Murmansk and down through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, and I'm not sure that we would have seen that if that war had turned hot. But anyway, very interesting. Now, going now into the modern era, we just extend this out to current. This data really stops around 2020, so I have some updates to do. But we can see the Chinese Navy really start to take off. I think around this period of time there was a bit of a lag, but you can see this 2007, 2004 was actually a pretty good year, but 2007 with 94 vessels commissioned. And I think what's more remarkable than that is this long tail that we see with the American Navy, going out to 2020. That there's a lot published on this. There's a lot published on ship counts. I wanted to really get into the metrics here, and part of it is looking at the number of ships, right? This graphic is number of ships, but I didn't really feel like that was the only metric to be looked at, and that's why I wanted to come up with an index, and that's why the title is index. And so let me now show just a few alternate ways to look at this data, not just ship counts. So if we look at the U.S. here, I put together a couple of these charts. This one, we can see that we've got a couple different kinds of submarines here. We can see the Los Angeles class, the SSN 688 class. Now, down the vertical axis, we can see a couple different metrics. One of them is how deep the vessel can dive, right? So these are in terms of the harpoon depth bands, which kind of go from shallow to intermediate to deep. And we see that many of the older submarines could dive to a significant depth, but they were somewhat limited in their speed. So we can see that, the 637 class was a numerous class, but its speed was about 26 knots. This was one of the things that was a specific design choice of the Los Angeles class. What they said is, we're not going to dive so deep, but we're going to be able to go much faster. So 32 knots for this vessel. So I was trying to capture that. We can see some of our current Virginia class. We can see some data here. It also is not intended to go deep. There was a big scare, especially as the Soviet Navy during that time had produced titanium hulled submarines that could dive very deep. There was a period of time where those submarines could dive deeper than even the American torpedoes could go. And so there was a kind of a rush to be able to develop torpedoes that could dive deep enough to get those submarines. But the philosophy, at least to current, is that we don't need to go deeper than about intermediate 5. So that you can see that with looking at those metrics here. Let's see. I don't want to take too much time here. We're now at 10.
Yeah, you have another half hour.
Okay. So maybe I'll just spend a few more minutes showing some of these graphics, and then I'm happy to take whatever questions exist. Let's look now at the Soviets. So this is the graphic I put together to try to describe the kind of classes that the Soviets were building, with the categorization across the vertical axis here on the right. I guess this is only submarines. We'll get to warships in a moment, but you can see that there's a large variety of classes that were put to sea by the Soviet Navy. Many of them nuclear submarines, so hunter-killer attack submarines to according to U.S. Navy and perhaps with some German advisors, that the mission of those attack submarines could have been attacking Allied shipping going into Europe, especially reinforcements perhaps coming across in a World War III scenario. But it turns out when you read the Soviet archives and their doctrine, they were this class of vessel, these multiple classes in this category were really focused on finding and destroying U.S. submarines, U.S. nuclear submarines, specifically this ballistic missile submarines. Right? That they were very concerned with nuclear strike on the mainland Soviet Union, and so that was a big threat, and that's really the target and the mission set that this category of ships was intended to deal with. This other kind of vessel, the guided missile nuclear submarine, this was intended to go after U.S. Navy aircraft carriers, which were also nuclear capable and quite a threat to mainland Soviet Union. Then they experimented with non-nuclear powered cruise missile submarines, SSGs, specifically of the Juliet class in the 60s. We can see that their own ballistic missile submarine, that they also experimented early in the 60s with a non-nuclear powered with the Gulf class, but they quickly shifted over to the Hotel class, and that they had this long pause before they really started ramping up with the Yankee class and subsequent classes. So yeah, interesting to see some of the challenges that they had catching up with the American Navy. So I may later on I may do some comparison to hold these side by side. Haven't done that yet, but I think it would be interesting. And you can see that even though the U.S. Navy after World War II had largely moved away from diesel power for their submarine force, the Soviets didn't have that same idea. They operated nuclear submarines as well as conventional powered submarines. Even the current, their Kilo class, we can see that their Kilo class has been the target of Ukrainian strikes in Crimea. In fact, I believe that they lost the submarine just in missile fire, but that remains a threat, largely because of the distance. Right, the United States has a couple big oceans to transit, and diesel-powered submarines will take a long time to do that, whereas nuclear-powered submarines can really shorten that time across the oceans. So, looking now to the warships, these Kirov class battle cruisers, there were 4 of them that were built with some pretty big gaps in between, but these were really the largest non-carrier battleships or battle cruisers that were put to sea during the Cold War, starting in 80 and then coming to 1988 was the last one. Cruisers, many different cruisers. I think that these were the Slava class, 3 Slava class put to sea. There's now 2 that remain. Sverdlov light cruisers. Here's their carriers. They really started with some helicopter carriers, the Moskva class. They moved on to the Kiev class, of which they built 4, and then followed by the Kuznetsov, which featured in that image that we saw. 2 of those were built. I think this one was the one that was transferred to China quite a few years back, maybe 20 years back. Destroyers, frigates, corvettes. Russians operate many small ships, largely because the frontier where their Navy operates is much closer to home than the U.S. Navy. For Japan, I didn't really complete as much of the Japanese analysis that I wanted to, so I have work to do in Japan. Let's look at China, though. So I put together something similar for submarines. Yeah, different ways of looking at this, but the Chinese Navy submarine force has quite a lineage and legacy from the Soviet force. I think that there were a lot of intellectual property that was shared between the Chinese and the Russians and the Soviets. So we can see that they are very actively building their Jin class SSBN. We know that that they actually had a different class back in the 80s, the Jia class, which was put up at about the same time as their Han class. This was a very noisy boat, so very easy to track, but this was them proving out that they could do it, proving that they had the missiles and could be launched at sea. And later on, they have much more capable boats. The Jin class is still under construction. I think that they have a new class that they're working on. So they also have this SSP. P stands for AIP propulsion. So this is starting with the Stirling engine. This is a way of generating electricity without snorkeling, so that they can stay underwater and avoid detection. So that's been part of the Chinese Yuan class ever since about 2006, and they continue to build that vessel. You can see that there's many different, the Kilo and improved Kilo are purchased from Russia, but the Ming, Romeo, Song, the Songma, these are Chinese origin. So let's see here. I think, yeah, we've come back to where I started here. So that is the status of my Naval Power Index. Those are some of the metrics that I'm looking at. I've seen some other people really look at metrics like the number of vertical launch cells that are capable of firing a missile and computing that as a metric of sea power. I think it's a little bit it's a little bit focused on the sea and the air domain, a little bit less focused on the undersea domain. There are, of course, ASW rockets, but I think that's through the lens of perhaps American Navy analysts who are seeing some of the Cold War legacy ships like the cruisers being the Ticonderoga cruisers being decommissioned. There's quite a number of vertical launch shells that are being taken out of the U.S. Navy, and there's some concern about what's going to replace those. Some of it's being replaced by the newer Virginia class, which have vertical launch shells to launch missiles, but there's questions about this. So that said, let me pause here and see if there's any questions, either on the presentation or on the data analysis.
Any questions online?
No, I don't have any questions. I thought that was very good, though. Is it possible for us to get access to this information? Like, are you going to print it off or publish it in some way?
Well, I can certainly provide the slides. I can also provide some of the data that is behind this. This tool that I've been using, this is actually a free tool that can be downloaded. So it's possible that I can, if you are interested and willing to install the MicroStrategy workstation, then that's something that I can certainly share a file and you can look through this. These are in-memory cubes. So I'm happy to share this. The database itself is currently in Postgres. So I am willing to share that to some degree, especially if we can collaborate on improving it and maintaining it. You can see that a lot of work has gone into this. And so if you're interested to collaborate and help maintain it and possibly expand it, for example, to cover the Australian Navy, the Royal Australian Navy would be a great addition.
Right. Okay. I may be able to do something in that area, but at least initially, if I could get just the slides, that would be really good. I think Chris and Jay have my email address, but I guess they can give it to you, and maybe you can just send it to me as an attachment to the slides for the first slide.
Sure.
All right.
We can work it. Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Clint. Yes, happy to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm interested in this graphic here. Is this just raw hull counts that it's doing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
It'd be interesting if you could pivot that into tonnage.
That's what I was thinking as well, because it doesn't really show if it's a carrier or a cruiser, or does it show submarines as well, or how does this what does this kind of look like?
Yes. So this is vessels. So vessels would be all classes and all categories. So submarines as well as surface ships. Yeah, this at this point, this metric is a simple count of vessels that I think that this is commissioned, if I'm not mistaken. So the good thing about this, for example, if we look at this, so so I do have loaded displacement in tons, which is a little bit different than standard displacement. But the reason why I wanted, I put together simply the vessel count because I had been doing, I think at the time, I put this together about a year ago. At the time, I was looking specifically at the definitions of displacement. So standard displacement is a somewhat anachronistic American term that was put in place during the Washington and subsequent London naval conferences. And that was because they didn't want to include the fuel because American vessels would largely contain a lot more fuel than their foreign compatriots. And so because that treaty was limiting tonnage, they were very careful about what did they mean by tonnage. And because I was assembling data across multiple nations, I didn't have a consistent and reliable metric that I felt like I could compare it. And so that's why I focused on vessel counts. But I hear you that tonnage. So let's see, if I look at the Soviets, yeah. So at least in these cubes are a SQL query against the database. And I was working on this database that includes many different metrics. And I noticed that I couldn't reliably get the same definition of tonnage. So that's why I didn't do it. But yes, I hear you. Tonnage is another classic metric to be used in this kind of analysis. So yes, thank you for that. Here's some additional things that I'm getting largely from the Harpoon data. So we can see that they have displacement in tons, but many times that sometimes might be fully loaded, sometimes might be standard, sometimes might be empty. It depends. But there are many different metrics to be used, and tonnage, I think it is an interesting one. But it really depends. If it's a warship, tonnage might tell you something. If it's an auxiliary ship or a logistics ship, tonnage tells you something, but it's telling you something different.
Yeah.
And of course, a submarine, the displacement of a submarine is also something different. So anyway, those are my thoughts on tonnage.
So really quickly, during your presentation, you talked about how there wasn't reliable data for Chinese submarines. However, in the data here, you show them a little bit earlier, and then, so where did you get that data from?
That data, I guess what I mentioned is that, wait, not this presentation. So let's go back to this one. So on this graphic, this was one of the sources for the Chinese Navy, and this graphic didn't have any submarines here. But if we go back here, so I got Chinese submarine data from globalsecurity.org, and I combined it with this, what started from a list of ships from Wikipedia, and then I enriched it with information from modern Chinese maritime forces, as well as the data from Harpoon. So there's some other sources here, but it was just some of these recognition guides that were focused on surface ships only.
Okay.
Yes.